All right, today we're jumping into a pretty fascinating and honestly, a pretty provocative theory about why civilizations rise and why they fall. Everything we're going to talk about comes straight from our source text. So let's just get right into it. Why do great civilizations fall? I mean, it's a question historians have been wrestling with forever, right? You've got these incredible empires that seem unstoppable, and then poof, they're gone. Well, the source material we're looking at today has a very specific idea about why that happens. First up, we're taking a bird's eye view of human history. The source kind of pans across the timeline, from ancient Egypt to the Roman Empire, trying to spot the patterns. What is the secret ingredient that makes a civilization work in the first place? And the idea presented is that civilization is basically the crystallization of human wisdom. Think of it like this. All that knowledge we build up over time, it solidifies. It becomes something real and lasting. And according to the source, there's one key engine that drives that whole process forward. And that engine, it's science and technology. Simple as that. The argument goes that this continuous progress is the one thing that really separates us from, say, other primates. I mean, they've been around a lot longer, but they're still in a primitive state. We, on the other hand, build skyscrapers and go to space. It all comes down to tech. Okay, so that's the rise part of the equation. Science and tech build us up. But what about the fall? If technology is so great, why do these amazing societies eventually collapse? That's the logical next question, and the source dives right in. And here's where we get to the core of the theory. It's this incredible contrast. On one side, you have science and tech pushing us up. But on the other side, there's this psychological flaw. The author calls it self-inflation, and they argue that's what triggers the whole thing to come crashing down. So what is self-inflation? Well, think of it like this. A civilization gets so big, so powerful, so successful that it starts to believe it's the greatest creator. It thinks it's the center of the universe. And that arrogance, that belief that it can just impose its will on everyone else, well, according to the author, that's literally planting the seeds of your own downfall. All right, so if that's the poison, what's the antidote? How do you stop this deadly pride from taking over? The author introduces this really interesting idea they call the eternal anchor. It's supposed to be this stabilizing force that keeps a civilization grounded. So this anchor is basically a deep-seated belief in something bigger than yourself, a higher power. The whole point is to stay humble. It's this constant reminder that, hey, no matter how smart we get or how much cool stuff we build, we are not the ones in charge of the entire universe. And for an example, the text points straight to the United States. The argument is that its rise as a global power is tied to this very principle. I mean, it's literally printed right there on their money. In God we trust. It's a public statement saying we rely on something beyond ourselves. Another example given is the Israeli nation. Think about it. The source highlights their incredible resilience through so much history, so many challenges. And the reason given for that survival? A deep spiritual foundation, anchored by its sacred texts. Then there's China. How has that civilization managed to persist for millennia? The author points to this key philosophical idea of correspondence between nature and humanity. It's all about this unity, this harmony between our world and a higher divine order. That's the anchor. Okay, but here's where it gets really specific. The author makes a pretty bold claim. Not just any belief system will do the trick. Not every religion or spiritual path works as this eternal anchor. So let's see why. So you might be thinking, okay, what if I don't believe in one greatest creator, but I believe in lots of gods? The text tackles that head on. The argument is that believing in a pantheon of gods just isn't enough to stop a civilization from collapsing under its own weight. And the reasoning breaks down into a few key points. First, just look at history. Plenty of ancient civilizations worshipped lots of gods, and they fell anyway. Second, these gods are often fighting amongst themselves. And third, the source claims they're just too busy with their own stuff to really take care of us down here. All right, so what about Buddhism? The source applies a pretty similar logic here, asking if Buddhism can really act as that protective anchor for a society. The argument here is that Buddhism's focus is fundamentally otherworldly. It's about rebirth, about the Elysium world, not necessarily about preserving civilization here on Earth. The source even points to history, saying that key figures in Buddhism couldn't always protect themselves from harm. So how could they protect an entire civilization? Okay, so after laying all of that groundwork, the whole argument builds to a pretty intense final warning. And this one is aimed squarely at us, right now, in our modern interconnected world. The author pulls out this ancient quote from Laozi. When people have no fear of force, then a great crisis will arrive. Whoa, that kind of sets the stage, right? But what force are we talking about here? It's not what you might think. And this is really the punchline of the whole theory. That great force, it isn't an army, it isn't a government. It's a power that, as the source says, we can't even imagine or control. It's the supernatural power of the greatest creator. The whole argument boils down to this. If we lose our reverence, our fear of that power, we are basically asking for a crisis. So what we're left with is a very stark choice. It's one or the other, with no middle ground. Either humanity keeps this idea of a greatest creator in its heart and civilization continues, or we don't, and it could all be wiped away at any moment. That's the ultimatum presented. And that's where the source leaves us. It leaves us with this huge question hanging in the air. What path are we going to choose? Will we prioritize serving something greater than ourselves, or are we going to ignore that existence and risk facing that great crisis? It's a question about our future, our humility, and maybe, just maybe, the survival of everything we've ever created.